Tensions inside the British royal family suddenly escalated when Prince William arrived for an extremely sensitive royal meeting. But the moment he stepped into the room, his eyes landed on a face that was never supposed to be there. This was not an ordinary guest. Sitting near King Charles's advisors was Camilla's private lawyer. He was holding a sealed leather folder and appeared completely comfortable, as if he had been officially invited to the highly confidential meeting. William stopped for a moment at the doorway. He looked across the room, then he looked at the people present. And what he did next left everyone stunned. William immediately canceled the Windsor Summit. There was no long argument, no hour-long delay, no formal discussion. The meeting was over. But the question was, what had happened that forced Prince William to take such a dramatic step? Why was Camilla's private lawyer inside the room? And most importantly, who had given him permission to be there? This was no ordinary royal meeting. The Windsor Summit had been called to discuss some extremely sensitive issues. The meeting was supposed to cover royal household authority, royal residences, private assets, collections, and the division of responsibilities during King Charles's reign. In other words, this was not a normal family gathering. The guest list had been deliberately kept very small. Only selected senior members, the king's private secretary, and constitutional advisors were approved to attend. Personal lawyers were excluded for a clear reason. Everyone in the room needed to be able to speak openly without outside pressure. But when William arrived, he saw exactly the situation the rules were designed to prevent. Camilla's representative was already there, and confidential briefing papers were sitting in front of him. William already knew there would be disagreements during the meeting, especially over Windsor apartments, private collections, and the future division of royal responsibilities. But he expected those disagreements to happen openly. He did not expect one side to have a private representative sitting inside the room before the meeting had even begun. William asked a direct question. Camilla tried to explain the situation. Her position was that the lawyer was there only to protect her interests. Wanting protection for her future, her home, her staff, and her position was not, by itself, unusual. But William had a different question. If Camilla needed protection for her position, why did that require her private lawyer to enter a meeting when no one else had approved his presence? That question changed the atmosphere in the room. King Charles's advisors lowered their eyes. The private secretary checked the attendance list again, but there was no official approval for the lawyer. In other words, he was not an authorized participant. And that was when William made his decision. He closed his briefing folder and made it clear that no discussion would continue until it was established who had allowed the man into the room and how confidential material had reached him. The Windsor Summit was canceled immediately. William instructed those present to leave the papers behind and ordered the room to be secured. But the story did not end there, because something written on the sealed folder made the situation even more serious. 4 words on the folder. William noticed the sealed folder. Written across it were the words, "Windsor Household Continuity, Private Instructions." Those words raised a new question. Had Camilla's lawyer come simply to provide legal advice? Or was he carrying a proposal connected to the future of the royal household? And if so, how had that proposal reached a confidential meeting without official approval? At this point, the issue was no longer simply about an unauthorized guest. It had become a sign of growing tension over royal authority and the future succession. The conflict had started. Weeks earlier, the roots of the dispute went back much further. Several weeks earlier, during a smaller meeting at Windsor, Camilla's lawyer had presented a proposed household memorandum. It included provisions concerning Camilla's future residence, access, and certain aspects of the royal household. But one part of the proposal touched directly on areas William believed were connected to his future responsibilities. There had already been growing tension over who would oversee Windsor apartments, ceremonial possessions, staff, and invitations if King Charles reduced his public duties in the future. William wanted all such proposals to be openly discussed by the family. His view was that an arrangement decided privately today could become an obligation for the future monarch tomorrow. Camilla saw the situation differently. She feared that her position could become weaker in the future. Her residence, staff, security, and ceremonial role could all potentially be reconsidered, and that fear gradually turned into growing distrust between the two sides. The turning point came 3 weeks earlier. Around 3 weeks before the Windsor Summit, Camilla's representative presented a draft during a memorial planning meeting. The document was titled the Queen's Household Continuity Memorandum. The proposal included provisions involving certain Windsor rooms, some staff appointments, and access to ceremonial possessions. But there was a problem. The meeting was not intended to decide future royal authority. It was a memorial planning meeting. The purpose was to discuss arrangements connected with remembrance, yet a proposal concerning future household control was introduced during that gathering. When William later received a copy, he read the final section and put the document down. He believed it was an attempt to turn temporary privileges into permanent authority. After that, William made one condition clear. Camilla's private lawyer would not be allowed to participate in the Windsor Summit, and William agreed to attend the meeting based on that assurance. But on the day of the summit, the same lawyer was already inside the room. That was why William did not see this simply as a violation of a rule. To him, it appeared that the situation had been prepared in advance, and now one question had to be answered directly. If the lawyer was not supposed to be there, who had allowed him into the room? The Windsor Summit had been canceled, but the real confrontation was only beginning. After the heavy door closed, Prince William turned toward Camilla and demanded a direct answer. There was no formal royal atmosphere now, no cameras, no public statement, and no official standing between them. The question was simple. If it had already been agreed that her private lawyer would not attend the meeting, how did he get inside? Camilla tried to explain her position. She said that her lawyer was there only to protect her position and her future. She was concerned about what would happen to her residence, household staff, security, and ceremonial role if King Charles's public responsibilities were reduced in the future. But for William, the issue was not Camilla's desire for protection. The issue was procedure. According to William, bringing a private representative into a confidential royal summit without authorization broke the trust on which the entire meeting was based. He reminded Camilla that it had already been made clear that her private lawyer would not participate. Yet the representative was inside the room before the meeting began. He had also seen restricted documents. William no longer believed this could simply be explained as a misunderstanding. To him, it looked as though the situation had been prepared in advance, leaving little opportunity for anyone to question the lawyer's presence. Camilla also made her position clear. Camilla argued that talking about procedure was easy when William's future was secure. William had a clear future role at the center of the monarchy. But Camilla's future was different. Her position after Charles's reign was not equally certain. That uncertainty was one reason she wanted independent legal advice. Camilla's argument was that she was not trying to take away anyone's authority. She simply wanted to make sure that her future would not depend entirely on someone else's decision after Charles was no longer in charge. But William did not consider that explanation enough. He immediately moved to another serious question. Who had given her lawyer the confidential summit papers? Camilla became silent. She did not give a clear answer, and that silence made the situation even more serious. Because if Camilla could not explain how her lawyer had obtained the meeting agenda and restricted papers, it suggested that someone else inside the palace might have been involved. The issue was no longer simply about an unauthorized visitor. The question had become how confidential information had reached him in the first place. The sealed folder was examined. Because of the situation, officials stopped the lawyer before he could leave Windsor. The sealed folder he was carrying was examined under palace security procedures. Inside were several important documents. There was an annotated meeting agenda. There were also proposed amendments that had never been circulated among the approved participants. But one handwritten instruction attracted the most attention. It claimed that the central proposal had already been discussed with the sovereign. In other words, It suggested that King Charles already knew about the proposal and had approved it. William read the sentence twice. His anger now took a different form. This was no longer simply a dispute between William and Camilla. King Charles's name had now been brought into the matter. Had Charles's approval been misused? When the disputed amendment was placed before King Charles, he examined the document carefully. The handwriting, the legal wording, and most importantly, the claim that he had already approved the proposal. But Charles made it clear that he had not given such approval. He had discussed Camilla's future security in general terms, but he had never approved permanent household powers. He had never authorized Camilla's lawyer to attend the summit, and he had never allowed his name to be used to support a private demand. That clarification created a major question. If Charles had not given that authorization, then who had used his name as if it represented official approval? That was when the decision was made to investigate the matter inside the palace. Charles ordered an investigation. King Charles called for his private secretary. He ordered a full access review. Who was supposed to attend the summit? Who had approved the visitor? Through whom had the documents been circulated? And what communications had taken place between Camilla's private household and her lawyer? Everything was to be examined. An access review meant a formal examination of who had been allowed into a restricted royal meeting and how that permission had been obtained. During the review, officials found an electronic access request. In that request, Camilla's lawyer had been described as a special constitutional advisor. That description was extremely important. A constitutional advisor could be understood as someone providing advice on the rules governing the monarchy. But in this case, the person was actually Camilla's private representative. His role had effectively been described in a different way to gain access to the restricted meeting. When William saw the wording, his concerns became even stronger. Charles was facing an impossible choice. King Charles was now in an extremely difficult position. On one side was his wife, Camilla, who feared for her future. On the other was his son, William, who was concerned about royal procedure and the long-term stability of the monarchy. Charles understood both sides. Camilla wanted security. William wanted certainty. But the way the situation had unfolded had damaged trust between them. William made it clear to his father that Camilla had every right to seek protection for her home, staff, and future. But using royal authority to bring a private arrangement into a confidential meeting without verified consent was different. According to William, the real problem was not what Camilla wanted. The problem was how that request had been advanced. Then Charles made his decision. After the information was reviewed, King Charles made his decision. He ordered the disputed household proposals to be suspended immediately. Camilla's lawyer was removed from internal royal consultations, and Camilla's private office was instructed to return all confidential papers connected to the summit. It was a major blow for Camilla. The issue was no longer limited to the cancellation of one meeting. Her representative's access to the palace was now also at risk. Windsor officials revoked the lawyer's visitor clearance. His access to internal documents was blocked, and any future legal submissions from him would have to go through Charles's official secretary. But the biggest blow was still to come. Camilla tried to speak to Charles. Camilla asked to meet Charles immediately. She wanted to explain her position herself. She wanted him to understand that her intention was not to challenge royal authority. She simply wanted reassurance about her future. But Charles refused to meet her immediately. He said he first needed to fully understand what had happened. For Camilla, that decision was deeply painful. She had not only lost her lawyer's access. The person she had considered her strongest source of protection was now keeping his distance while the situation was investigated. And William did not see the decision as a personal victory either. He had stopped the summit because he believed royal procedure was at risk. But the decision had also exposed a deeper tension between his father and Camilla. Windsor had started with one unexpected person inside a private meeting. Now it had become a much bigger question about royal authority, future power, and trust within the family. And the biggest question remained: would William and Camilla ever be able to fully trust each other again? The Windsor Summit had been canceled. Camilla's lawyer had lost his access. The confidential documents had been ordered back, and the disputed household memorandum had been suspended. But the most difficult part of the entire situation was still ahead, because the issue was no longer simply about an unauthorized lawyer or a disputed document. The bigger question was, could King Charles still trust his wife? And did William believe that decisions affecting the future of the monarchy would be made openly and properly? Neither question had an easy answer. Charles was caught in the middle, King. Charles was facing an extraordinary situation. On one side was his wife, Camilla, who feared that her position could change if Charles's role became weaker or eventually came to an end. On the other side was his son, William, who was already thinking about his future responsibilities as monarch. Charles understood both concerns. Camilla wanted security. William wanted certainty, but the way the situation had unfolded had damaged trust between them. William's position was that Camilla had every right to protect her personal interests, but royal procedure could not be bypassed to achieve that protection. If a private proposal entered a confidential meeting without proper approval, it could potentially become an obligation for the future monarch. That was what concerned William the most. William was thinking about the future. As Prince of Wales, William was not looking only at the present. He was thinking about the time when he would eventually take responsibility for the monarchy. Royal residences, private collections, household authority, staff arrangements, ceremonial responsibilities. Decisions about all of these areas could be made today, but their effects could continue into a future reign. That was why William was concerned about any arrangement created without a clear family process. His fear was that if a private agreement was created now, it could become extremely difficult to change later. And this was where William and Camilla saw the situation very differently. Camilla was focused on protecting her future. William was focused on protecting the long-term continuity of the monarchy. Camilla's biggest concern, Camilla was also facing an uncertain future. As queen consort, her constitutional authority was not the same as that of the monarch. Her role was connected to Charles's reign. That meant questions about her position after Charles would naturally arise. Her residence, personal staff, security arrangements, and ceremonial responsibilities could all potentially change. That uncertainty appeared to be behind her actions. She wanted arrangements that could protect her, even if Charles's active role in the monarchy became smaller. But William saw the same situation differently. He believed temporary protection could potentially become permanent control, and that difference in perspective pushed the tension even further. Another record came under review. As the investigation continued, palace officials reviewed communications and access records again. They wanted to understand exactly when Camilla's lawyer had received confidential information about the summit, who had provided the meeting agenda, who had approved the access request, and why had the lawyer been described as a constitutional advisor? Every question appeared to lead in the same direction. A route had been created that allowed a private representative to enter a restricted royal meeting, and it had happened just before the meeting was due to begin. The timing made William even more suspicious. To him, it no longer looked like a simple administrative mistake. Charles defended the truth about his own position. The most serious issue remained the handwritten instruction, claiming that the central proposal had already been discussed with the sovereign. But Charles made it clear that this was not accurate. He had discussed Camilla's future security in general terms. However, he had never approved permanent household powers. He had never authorized her lawyer to attend the summit, and he had never given permission for his name to be used to make a private proposal appear officially approved. That clarification removed one mystery, but it immediately created another. Who had turned a general conversation with Charles into something that appeared to be formal approval? The palace tightened the process. After the disputed proposals were suspended, the internal process became much stricter. Camilla's lawyer was removed from internal consultations, his visitor clearance was revoked, and confidential documents had to be returned. From that point forward, any legal submission connected to Camilla's private representative would have to go through Charles's official secretary. This was more than an administrative change. It sent a clear message about how authority inside the royal household would be handled. Camilla felt everything had changed. Camilla had hoped to speak privately with Charles. She wanted to explain her fears directly. She wanted him to understand that she was trying to protect her future. But Charles chose to keep his distance until the full situation was understood. For Camilla, that may have been the most painful part. Losing her lawyer's access was already a serious setback. But Charles's decision to remain distant sent an even stronger message. The person she believed would be her strongest protection was now choosing to remain cautious. And that made Camilla realize that the situation had become much more serious than she had expected. William was not celebrating. William did not feel like he had won either. He had stopped the summit because he believed royal procedure was at risk, but the decision had increased the tension between his father and Camilla. Catherine also understood William's position. She recognized that allowing the meeting to continue under those circumstances could later raise questions about how those proposals had been approved. Still, William faced an emotional problem. He had protected an institutional boundary, but in doing so, he had also placed his father in an extremely difficult position. And now the issue was much bigger. The Windsor Summit remained postponed indefinitely. Camilla's lawyer was outside the royal family's internal meetings. The disputed memorandum remained suspended, and the confidential papers had been returned. But the future was still uncertain. Because once a royal household begins questioning who has the authority to make decisions, canceling one meeting is not enough to solve the problem. William wanted every future arrangement to follow a clear process. Camilla wanted her future security to depend on more than one person's goodwill, and Charles was trying to find a balance between the two. But one thing had become clear. The real conflict inside the royal family was not only about power today, it was about the future of the monarchy after Charles. And that raised the biggest question of all. Would William and Camilla ever be able to fully trust each other again? The Windsor Summit had been canceled. Camilla's lawyer had lost his access. The confidential documents had been returned, and the disputed household memorandum had been suspended. But the biggest impact of the entire dispute was not the documents or the canceled meeting. It was the effect on trust within the royal family. Because this situation had brought three very different concerns together. William was worried about the future of the monarchy. Camilla was worried about her own future and security, and Charles was caught between them. For William, this was a warning. For Prince William, the incident made one thing clear. Any major arrangement involving the future of the monarchy could not be decided through private negotiations. Whether it involved royal residences, household staff, ceremonial possessions, or future responsibilities, William believed that every decision needed a clear process. His concern was not simply about his own authority. He was thinking about the time when he would eventually become monarch. He did not want to inherit arrangements that had been secretly created before his reign and could later become difficult to change. For William, transparency was not simply an administrative principle. It was part of protecting the continuity of the monarchy. But Camilla's situation was also uncertain. For Camilla, the incident sent a very different message. Her biggest concern was how secure her position would be after Charles. As queen consort, her constitutional authority was not the same as the monarch's. That meant her position after Charles's reign could naturally become a question. Her residence, personal staff, security arrangements, and ceremonial responsibilities could potentially change. That was the uncertainty behind her concerns. She wanted protection that would remain in place even if Charles's active role became smaller. But now her private lawyer had been removed from internal consultations. His visitor clearance had been revoked, and confidential royal papers had to be returned. Most importantly, Charles had chosen to allow the investigation to continue rather than immediately take her side. That showed Camilla that her future could not simply depend on personal trust. Charles was facing both a personal and institutional crisis. King Charles was perhaps in the most difficult position of all. He could not simply ignore his wife's concerns, but he also could not dismiss William's concerns about royal procedure and institutional stability. If Charles had ignored the lawyer's presence, William could have seen it as a sign that royal procedures could be bypassed for private interests. But if Charles fully sided with William, Camilla could feel that her future would become insecure once Charles's active role ended. So Charles chose a middle path. He suspended the disputed proposals. He removed the lawyer from internal consultations. and he ordered a review of the access process. In other words, he placed procedure ahead of personal relationships. But one major question remained. If Charles had never approved permanent household powers, then who had used his name? If the lawyer had not been officially authorized, how had he gained access to the restricted room, and how had confidential summit information reached him? These were the questions that could determine the real picture behind the entire dispute. Because an unauthorized person entering a private meeting was one problem, but confidential information reaching that person beforehand was a much more serious issue. That was why the Windsor Summit was not simply delayed for a short period. It was postponed indefinitely. William and Charles reached a new understanding. Despite everything that had happened, William did not make a personal attack against his father. He made it clear that Camilla had every right to seek protection for her home, staff, and future. But advancing a private arrangement using royal authority without verified consent was something different. Charles also understood William's concern. He realized that his son was not simply trying to protect his own future position. William was trying to protect the process of an institution he would one day be responsible for leading. That helped move the dispute beyond a personal family argument. The real question became where the line should be drawn between private interests and institutional authority. Catherine's role was also important during the tension. Catherine understood William's position. She recognized that if the summit had continued under those circumstances, questions could later have been raised about how those decisions had been approved. For William, the decision had not been easy. He had stopped the meeting, but that also meant dealing with the emotional damage between his father and Camilla. So this was not a victory for him. It was a decision he believed was necessary for the long-term stability of the monarchy. What happens next? The Windsor Summit remained postponed indefinitely. The disputed memorandum remained suspended. Camilla's lawyer remained outside internal royal consultations, and palace officials were reviewing how confidential information had been circulated. But it was still unclear whether the summit would eventually take place again, and if it did, who would be allowed to attend. One thing, however, had become clear. No proposal could simply be accepted because it was connected to a senior member of the royal family. Authority would have to be verified. Access to confidential documents would have to be controlled, and future household arrangements would have to follow a clear process. The biggest lesson from the entire story. A meeting had been canceled inside Windsor that day, but the impact went far beyond one canceled meeting. William had drawn a boundary. Camilla had realized that her future was not as secure as she had believed, and Charles had been forced to understand that as king, he had to do more than balance the interests of his family. He also had to protect the integrity of the monarchy as an institution. On one side was personal trust, on the other was royal procedure. And the Windsor Summit had exposed the difficult line between the two. The biggest question was no longer simply who had allowed a lawyer into the room. The real question was, can Charles, William, and Camilla rebuild the trust that has been damaged? Because if they cannot, the meeting that was canceled at Windsor could become the beginning of much bigger changes inside the royal family.